Good morning. You're listening to the What's at Stake on WPFW 89.3. And I'm Reverend Graylin Scott Hagler, your host every second Wednesday of the month. Our executive producer is Verna Avery Brown. And our engineer this morning is Michael Nasala. And we are a listener-supported station, and your contributions keep us on the air, bringing to you Jazz and Justice. We're bringing to you this morning the Jazz mandate in our mission. It is good that you are with us. We are excited that you're with us this morning. I wrote an article this week about all of the fuss around the comments that Whoopi Goldberg made. She was trying to articulate something that was at the core of her being, something at the core of many of us who are descendants of stolen people from the continent of Africa. You can go to my Facebook page and read the article, but in a nutshell, it talks about the Holocaust being elevated over all of the other Holocausts that have existed in the world, and that enslaved populations in the Americas and the Caribbean were subjected to 400 years of death camps and billions of lives lost. But there seems to be no outcry to this history when slavery and the horrific misery of that history is minimized. Instead, we have political forces in this country that is trying to erase our history and make our experiences non-existent. Now, I'm not trying to compare pain, one person's pain to another person's pain, one group's pain to another group's pain, but pointing out that one genocidal enterprise in history is no more important than all the others. I invite you to read that article, and if you want to, you can share your comments with me. Just thank you for your attention. This morning, we will be discussing domestic workers. You see them with children in the parks, and the children don't look like them. They clean houses and they keep homes. They take care of children and families. They are largely immigrants, largely women, and many living without the rights or benefits or protections that most of us would respect. Today we have with us Eichner, who is the lead organizer with the DC chapter of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, where she is working with domestic workers to build their power in the DMV. She has worked in federal advocacy to fight for policies that support domestic workers, childcare workers, and women in low-wage jobs. And before that, she was at the National League of Cities and the National Women's Law Center. Also with us is Kearney, who was originally from Northwest Arkansas and located to the DC metro area in 2010. She is an active leader in the DMV chapter of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. She graduated from the University of Arkansas with a BS in elementary education and a master's in sociology, and has over a decade of experience working with children and young people. I want to just welcome you to our program this morning. It's good to have you on. Alina and Ann, and why don't you just share with us a little bit about what's going on, the things that you're working on, who you are, and what is this organization that I've mentioned that is the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Tell us a little bit.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's such a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for your decades and decades of leadership on issues of anti-racism and civil rights, which are deeply connected to the issue we're here to talk about, domestic workers.
How do we pronounce your last name?
My last name is Eichner.
Eichner, okay, I wanted to get it right, okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Ann and I are part of the DC chapter of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. So the National Domestic Workers Alliance is a national organization that works for the respect, dignity, and recognition of the 2.2 million domestic workers in this country who are home care workers who care for people elderly and people with disabilities, their nannies who care for children, and their house cleaners who clean our homes. We like to say that domestic work is the work that makes all other work possible, because it allows people to do their jobs knowing that their loved ones and their homes are being taken care of. And Ann and I are part of the local DC chapter. There are about 9,000 domestic workers who work in Washington, D.C., and some live in DC and many live outside of DC and come into the city for work. And as you mentioned, domestic workers are overwhelmingly women. In DC, over 92% who work here are women. And this has always been the case about domestic work. In DC, over 70% are immigrants and 91% are people of color. So these are primarily jobs being done by immigrant women of color. And we're fighting for these jobs to be valued and respected, which is a really long overdue fight. So we can share more about that, but I'll let Anne introduce herself.
Yes, Anne. Welcome, Anne.
Hi, thanks for having us. I'm Anne. I've been a nanny for over 15 years. I started working as a nanny in college. I was working 3 jobs to put myself through college. In my first position, I made $8 an hour. I didn't have a contract and I just didn't even know these things existed. My work responsibilities were everything imaginable. Besides caring for the children, it was gardening, walking their dog, cleaning their house. In 2011, I became a full-time nanny. I just love the one-on-one relationship that you get with families and the children.
All right. Well, it's good to have you here. And as I want to just open up the discussion around this, tell us a little bit about the history and the origins of the Alliance. Why
Absolutely.
Did it start? Where did it get started? Who started it? Those types of things.
Great question. The National Domestic Workers Alliance was founded in 2007, and there were many independent organizations across the country, mostly on the East Coast and the West Coast, but across the country, who had started organizing domestic workers as part of what their organization did. And at the US Social Forum in 2007 in Atlanta, these distinct organizations came together and realized that they could learn a lot from each other by uniting as a network. And so that's how they became the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And since 2007, NDWA now has over 70 affiliates and chapters across the country. In 2010 was the first time that a domestic workers' bill of rights was won. And when the Alliance started in 2007, domestic workers in New York were already fighting and agitating to win this legislation in New York, which would end many of the exclusions that domestic workers faced in state law in New York and give them new rights and benefits. And so these affiliates, these different groups that made up NDWA learned from each other, and many of them began to fight and win state legislative fights across the country to end the exclusion of domestic workers from very common workplace rights and benefits, where the domestic workers are excluded from in many cities and states across the country.
So I hear you talk about started in Atlanta, New York, DMV, where else?
NDWA is all across the country. We have chapters and affiliates in Massachusetts, Texas, California, Chicago, Maryland, Virginia, Atlanta, North Carolina, Philadelphia. So many, many places. And I would be remiss not to say that the founding of the Alliance stands on the shoulders of decades and decades before that of domestic worker organizing. So we're just the latest kind of iteration of the domestic worker movement. So we often talk about our movement for Mother Dorothy Bolden, who was a Black woman organizing in the South and organized domestic workers who were working in the South. And really, we stand on the shoulders of her and many others. This is work that dates back to the origins of this country. Domestic work has been a feature of life in the US, beginning with enslaved and indentured and semi-free women in colonial times. And for much of the 19th century, domestic work was a major source of employment, if not the principal occupation for Black women in the South, as well as for Mexican and Mexican American and Native women in the West and Southwest, for Asian women and men in California and Hawaii, and for European immigrant women in the Northeast. So this work has been done for a very long time, and so has the organizing of domestic workers for better rights and conditions.
All right. And I know that you're part of the Nannies Association, and you have worked as a nanny, and tell us a little bit about those experiences.
Yes, I'm super honored to have worked with amazing families. All of the families I highly respect. The International Nanny Association is a group of individuals who have came together to speak up for nannies' rights, to chat about how we can make the experiences at homes better. Yes, it's been incredible. I love my job, but at the same time, other individuals are not as lucky in their positions. So I'm here to speak for them as well as myself, because pregnancy protections are a big thing. I'm at the age where people decide to have families. Many people have lost their job because they became pregnant, and those rights need to be expanded.
What are some of the nationalities, the ethnic groups of a lot of the nannies?
Oh my goodness. African American, Latino. There's a lot of Caribbean nannies, people from all around the world. I've met a very diverse group. I would say it's international.
All right, all right. And let me ask you a question. How do people get to be a nanny, so to speak? How do you get to be a nanny?
That's a great question. There's online groups where individuals are asking for care, and they've had a baby and they need help. There's nanny agencies, there's word of mouth, like there's all an array of areas where people decide to become a nanny.
All right, all right. And it would seem to me that as you work to sort of try to organize, you're dealing with a diversity of language, diversity of cultures, people at all degrees of being intimidated. It's like you're not necessarily secure or feel secure when you're not of the dominant group. Tell us some of the complexities around that, what people are experiencing, what people are afraid of, the kinds of dynamics that people face, particularly who they are and where they come from.
Yeah, well, I could just start by saying that I think I mentioned that of domestic workers who work in DC, about 70% are immigrants. And I think about half of those are immigrants who are undocumented. And so many undocumented immigrants do this work and face tremendous levels of fear around retaliation related to their immigration status. And so we know that undocumented domestic workers make lower wages, face higher rates of violations at the workplace, and are much less likely to speak up. 2012 report tells us that 85% of undocumented workers, domestic workers who experienced problems in their working conditions, didn't speak up because they were afraid that their immigration status would be used against them. So that's one major factor in this work. Another is just the very intimate relationships between domestic workers and their employers. If you can imagine, it's usually just you're the only employee in a private home, you're in the employer's private home. And there's no HR department to report a complaint to. So there's this very intense power dynamic many times between employers and their domestic worker employees. And these jobs often have a high degree of informality, like Anne mentioned, not having a contract. A lot of this work happens in the informal economy. And so our experience is that employers often don't feel completely very accountable to domestic work employees. So if something comes up, they have all the power to fire someone, and that person, the employee is really at kind of the mercy of the employer and their goodwill to keep their job and to have strong working conditions. So there's a lot of vulnerabilities in this work, and the isolated environments make it an industry with very high rates of wage theft and other workplace violations, as well as harassment on the job.
And you have anything to add to that?
No, Alana wrapped it up perfectly. I appreciate that.
All right, all right. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to What's at Stake on WPFW Radio 89.3. I'm Reverend Graylin Scott Hagler, your host every second Wednesday of the month. Today we are discussing domestic workers, and our guests are Kearney and Eichner. One of the things that you're trying to present is a Bill of Rights. Can you tell us what is in that Bill of Rights?
Yes. I can share a little bit about this policy, but I'm hoping Anne will speak to what kind of impact this would really have in the lives of her and other nannies and other domestic workers. I'll start by saying that there have been now 10 cities and 2 states that have passed domestic workers' bills of rights. And we think Washington, D.C. should absolutely be the next place to pass such legislation. So there's strong precedent for this all over the country. Domestic workers' bills of rights are a model of legislation that have ended the exclusions of domestic workers from key workplace laws and created new rights and benefits for domestic workers. When a lot of federal labor laws were being created in the 1930s, domestic workers were explicitly and intentionally left out of those labor laws because this was overwhelmingly Black women who are doing this work, and political leaders who are passing these laws didn't want to give that level of power to organize and to have higher wages to this predominantly Black workforce. So domestic workers were left out of the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act, giving workers the right to organize and the right to federal overtime and minimum wage. And many of those federal exclusions became reflected in local and state laws. And that's what happened in Washington, D.C. Before Washington, D.C. had home rule in 1973, the laws were strictly, much more strictly dictated by Congress. And so this federal exclusion of domestic workers made its way into DC human rights law. And when DC gained home rule in 73, there were no, at that time, substantive huge changes made to the human rights law. So the exclusion was carried over into DC's law. If you look at DC's Human Rights Act, the part that guarantees protections against discrimination on the job, you'll see that in the definition of who's an employer that has to follow this law, it says employers of everyone except domestic servants. And that's where this exclusion lies. So that means that domestic workers in DC do not receive protections against discrimination at work on the basis of race, immigration status, sex, and many other characteristics that are in DC's human rights law. So
why would that exemption be put into the law?
a great question. We've done some legal research into it, and the best we understand is that it was put into the law because of racism and sexism, pure and simple, because there was notions that this work, primarily done by women of color, particularly Black women, is not real work that deserves the same protections as other work, like overtime, like minimum wage, like protections against harassment, that what happens in your private home is just your private business, and that this is not somebody's workplace and doesn't deserve to be regulated the same way. So that is our understanding. In some ways, it's not complicated. It's a longstanding racial and gender devaluing of domestic work. So
yes, jump in there.
Yes, I've touched on this before, but there could be new listeners. So including domestic workers in the DC Human Rights Act by passing this Bill of Rights would strengthen the protections for domestic workers against pregnancy discrimination at work. I've encountered nannies who are fired from their jobs for being pregnant, and not having this right has implications for me and all nannies. So it's just really important. We need to be in the DC Human Rights Act. It's ridiculous that we need to say that, but yes, we need to be included. Also, domestic workers' Bill of Rights would fund community organizations to help workers know their rights. When I was starting out as a career nanny, I didn't know my rights until I met a group of individuals who are also nannies. Domestic work is an isolated environment, and domestic workers don't have coworkers to share this information about their rights. It's essential that the government invest in domestic workers to be aware of their rights and to let them know what to do if their rights are violated.
Right, right. Well, and and it's interesting when you look back and you see the types of things that were left out of the law, the lack of protections that were always protection that was afforded one group, but protections that were not afforded another group, based on economics, based on race, based on gender, all those other types of things, right? I mean, because when you really talk and look at DC, just like a lot of other places, but DC, particularly with all the government stuff that was going on, had a big cadre of domestic workers, particularly at one point in its history, right? Servicing all of these homes, servicing all of these government officials and workers and not government workers, that type of stuff. And so it's really glaring that that gets left out as a whole part of the lack of protections that are afforded groups of people. And then you have a transition. You have a transition from largely Black domestic workers to immigrant domestic workers. So you got that transition that takes place, particularly as Blacks are able to enter the job market in a whole different way, and not just relying upon being domestic workers any longer. When I look back at my family in Baltimore, all of the women in my family were domestic workers, right? My mother broke that cycle, but everybody else were domestic workers, working somewhere, a cook somewhere, a nanny somewhere. Those types of things. So, it's an important piece of, again, the history of this country. So I'm glad that you continue to bring this up. And let me ask this question. With all of the different languages and nationalities, what are some of the obstacles to organizing? Because that's got to present an obstacle to organizing. You have people who are working in private homes. You have people that speak different languages as their primary language. And it's not the same primary language, right? It's a variety of languages, a variety of cultural backgrounds, racial backgrounds for that matter. How do you break through all of those barriers that are set up to organize and bring people into the movement?
It's such a good question. You're hitting the nail on the head about many of the unique challenges of organizing domestic workers. And I think in the beginnings of our movement, people have always said that domestic workers can't be organized, that it's impossible because there's not one workplace like a school or a factory or a restaurant where you're organizing a group of workers. Domestic workers, like you say, are working individually in private homes. So what we do to organize is we go to where domestic workers are. We go to parks where during the day where nannies are with children and talk to them about the National Domestic Workers Alliance. We, go to bus stations at the end of the day where many workers are leaving their jobs and going back home to Maryland, perhaps where they live, and talk to them about the National Domestic Workers Alliance. But it is extremely hard to organize because there's not one workplace, as you say, and yes, we're a very multiracial, multilingual group. And so some things practically that means is, for instance, in the DC chapter, when all of our meetings are bilingual and all of our meetings have interpretation because we're a group that has a lot of Spanish speakers and a lot of English speakers and people who speak other languages. And so that means always having language interpretation to make it an accessible space for everyone. It also means doing our work on anti-racism and anti-Blackness in particular, so that we're creating spaces that are, anti-racist in nature, particularly because so much of the devaluation of domestic work started with anti-Blackness in particular, and we have to keep a fight against that at the center of our work because it's so endemic to the industry and the conditions of this industry, as well as essential to building the multiracial group of workers that we want in our organization. So it's an ongoing challenge.
You keep saying anti-Blackness. What does that mean?
To me, that means the racism, particularly against Black individuals. And I think, and to me, that's at the heart of domestic work because the exclusions in law came from the fact that these were overwhelmingly Black workers doing this work, and that many of the first domestic workers in this country were women who were enslaved. And so it's absolutely, it's so much part of our history, but it's very much part of the present as well of this work.
All right, we're going to take a short break and bring some announcements on. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to What's at Stake on WPFW FM 89.3. I'm Reverend Graylin Scott Hagler, your host every second Wednesday of the month, and we are speaking with Alina Eichner and Ann Kearney from the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And we invite you to join the discussion when we return. You can call in your questions and comments to 202-588-0893. That's 202-588-0893. Just pause right now for some announcements.
Black is you, black is me, black is us, black is free, black is free, black is me.
Black is the velvet of the midnight sky. Black is so beautiful it makes you cry. These are the words of the last poets from their prolific poem, Black Is. In this spirit, Pacifica Radio and affiliates present a very special network-wide day of programming celebrating Black History Month. On Monday, February 21st, the 57th anniversary of Malcolm X's assassination, from 6 a.m. until 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 a.m. until 9 p.m. Eastern, programmers throughout the network come together to present Black Is, 360 degrees of the Black experience. Listen to Black Is on your local Pacifica station or online at pacifica.org. For additional information, email blackhistoryspecial@gmail.com. Pacifica Radio, building a better world, one broadcast at a time.
I'm Eugenia Charles, host of Commit Lakai. Fans and supporters of Commit Lakai, mark your calendar. Commit Lakai is moving to every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. starting on February 9, 2022. Tune in to WPFW every Wednesday at 7 p.m. for news, information, and live discussion about Haiti. À partir du 9 février, Commit Lakai a fait chaque mercredi à 7h p.m. WPFW, building a better world, one broadcast at a time.
Welcome back. This is Reverend Graylin Scott Hagler, your host every second Wednesday of the month on What's at Stake on WPFW FM 89.3. We are joining in the discussion this morning. We have with us Ann Kearney and also Alina Eichner from the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And we invite you to join in on the discussion. You can dial 202-588-0893. 202-588-0893 to ask your questions and to share your comments. I just want to ask Alina or Ann, how many people are part right now of the Domestic Workers Alliance here in the DMV?
That's a great question. We probably have about 150 active members and about 3,000 who we're in contact with, but we haven't yet brought all of them in to actively be part of our work, but we want to reach every domestic worker in the DMV area.
All right. How many are across the country have organized into chapters?
NDWA is in regular communication or actively working with about 250,000 domestic workers across the country between all of our chapters and affiliates and our online communications with folks.
All right. We do have a caller on the line. I want that caller to join in the discussion. Good morning.
Hello, is this me?
Yes, you're on.
Yes, hello. Good morning, Reverend, and good morning to the ladies. First of all, love WPFW. Always makes me a better person and a better citizen by the programming. Love this program. Quick question. I went to your National Domestic Workers Alliance website. Just wondering, are caregivers a part of this alliance?
That's a good question. Want to answer the question?
Yes, they are. Thank you for that question. When we use the word domestic workers, we're talking about nannies, house cleaners, and caregivers who care for seniors or those with disabilities, and all range of caregivers, CNAs and PCAs, people who provide care in private homes.
Carla, are you still there?
I am still here, and I'm very happy to hear that. Also, too, ladies, for research, you said you wanted to maybe gather some domestic workers who you see out at parks and all that. I would get in some of these, be friendly about it, but get in some of these parking lots and some of these nationally caregiver associations, if you will, that you may see on television. I think those women or men are great people to sort of get a background about it. And the reason I say that is because a care worker is also a domestic worker by default. And a lot of times what I find the track is that a lot of folks may start off as a domestic worker, and then they end up being a caregiver. They scratch away a little money, and then they go to one of these college courses and get an accreditation for like 6 months, and then you work at one of these agencies. And the only reason I'm talking about this is because regulation, because I still, even with regulation, you're still kind of pigeonholed, because I had hired one of these caregivers, if you will, for my mother. I was her caregiver as well as I needed additional help, and I hired a caregiver. And one of the things I found quite daunting and a little, it just left a really bad taste in my mouth, is that, as you know, with elderly folk or anybody in a vulnerable situation, an elderly person needs to bond with you, and this person is a stranger in my home and some trust built. But the thing that I found very daunting is that people were only allowed to work a certain amount of hours, and they still weren't even making a lot of money. So even if I wanted to hire this person for overtime, they didn't get it. And if I, on my own, out of my own pocket, wanted to hire one of those folks to stay extra hours, that person could be possibly fired, because those people would come into your house for like a monthly analysis to see what's going on. They go, well, this person can't be in your home after 30 hours because that's just not allowed. So I just wanted to implement that into talking to those folks, because they have a vast variety of knowledge about this whole thing. Thank you so much for the programming. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Colin. That's very, very good points that you're making in terms of that, because what I deal with through the church a lot of the times are families that have caregivers in the home. And so that is a very important slice of this discussion. You want to comment to any of that? Either one of you, Ann or Alina?
I love the organizing tip suggestion of where we can encounter additional caregivers, because we very much want more caregivers part of the the DC chapter of NDWA. And the only thing I would say about the issue the caller raised about not being able to pay overtime or get more hours, I think part of that problem is there needs to be a bigger investment at the federal and state level in Medicaid funding, which is how most home care is. Not all, a lot of it's privately paid, but the majority is funded through the Medicaid system. And without additional investment, we can't have things like more hours for consumers of care and better wages for home care workers. And so NDWA at the national level is fighting hard for a huge new infusion of money into the Medicaid system for home care through the Build Back Better legislation. So we're fighting hard for that still to pass, so that money can come to Maryland, to DC, to Virginia, and raise wages and make care more available to consumers.
Oh, good. And you have anything you want to add to that?
Yes, I just appreciate your call. Thank you so much for calling in. I understand about being a caregiver. I was a caregiver for my mom as well. It's very difficult. Finding care is also extremely difficult. I recognize your pain points. Yes, and I agree with Alana, the Build Back Better. I encourage you to check out Caring Across Generations. It's a great support group for individuals taking care of family members.
Amen. If you want to join in the discussion, you can at 202-588-0893. 202-588-0893. We are interested in your comments and your questions. As you look at sort of really sort of organizing and working around these issues, how do you get people who are not thinking about this? And I'm talking really now about the kind of folks that you're trying to press this on, which are elected officials. How do you get them to listen to it, understand it? Because the first thing they're going to say is a big part of these workers aren't voters. And therefore, why should they be concerned?
We have definitely encountered that line of thinking. And because of economic displacement in DC and how expensive it is to live in DC, many workers who work in DC don't live here. So they're not constituents in that way. We try to put the personal stories of workers, like what Anne talked about her, the wages in her first job and the lack of a contract. We try to put workers' personal stories at the front and center of everything we do. So we never meet with an elected official without having workers tell their stories. And we think that's meaningful and powerful and impacts elected officials. But we also try to make it very personal. Every person has a connection to care in some way or another. You were cared for, someone in your family was a domestic worker, you were a domestic worker, you hired a domestic worker. So with elected officials, we often try to ask them what their connection is to care. Did they have a domestic worker in their house growing up? Did they care for a home care worker for their ailing parents? And make it really personal. I think, and the last thing is we really try to connect it to broader trends. So we talk about how the baby boomer population is rapidly aging, and there's this huge crisis in the number of care workers that we currently have versus what we need. And we talk about how care is supporting everything else. And so we hope that elected officials, between personal stories, between their own connections, and between the way this is at the heart of kind of this care crisis that we're facing, that they see it as a relevant issue. And in DC, we hope and think that many elected officials here rightly see DC as a leader in some ways, in many ways, of progressive policies, and to have the nation's capital be a place where this racist relic of slavery, this language that excludes domestic servants in our law still exists, we hope is shameful and embarrassing to elected officials, and they'll want to change it.
We're going to go to a caller, get a caller on the line. We invite you to join in the discussion. Caller, welcome. Go ahead, you're on the air.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Reverend Scott, so much for your leadership and for highlighting this important issue. And I actually had a couple questions. One for Ms. Eichner. If you could kind of tell us where the bill stands right now in the process, in the legislative process, and if there are other organizations and other groups or communities that support the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights in Washington, D.C. And then for Anne, first of all, thank you so much for your work. I love the statement that domestic work makes all other work possible. So as someone who is involved in other work, I appreciate all the work that you do. And I would love to hear just, personally, how have you benefited because so much of domestic work is done separately from other people. How have you benefited personally from being a part of the National Domestic Workers Alliance? How is it, how has that improved your life in whatever way? And I'll hang up and listen to the answers. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you, caller. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for calling. That is a great question. One of the things that I think has improved my life the best is meeting these amazing individuals who are fighting for rights. Like, for example, Alana, I saved her on my screen as Alana Superhero. Like, these people are so inspiring. Their stories are spectacular. The adversities they've faced just inspire me. They've created real friendships and stronger contracts. So like, I'll talk to another individual and I'll be like, oh, you have that in your contract, so I should be asking for this holiday off. Oh, time and a half. I didn't know about time and a half until several years past my nanny career. Like, employers are not going to give this like, oh, well, we're going to actually give this, you have to fight for your rights. So knowing from your experiences with other people and the friendships, you strengthen your ability to negotiate. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, yes, it does. Yes, it does. We have another caller on the line. I'm gonna go to that caller. Caller, come on and share your comment or your question. Good morning. Caller, you're on the line. You're on the air. Good morning, caller. You're on the air.
Thank you. I wanted to, first of all, give a quote from Rosalind Carter about caregiving. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you fine.
Rosalind Carter, the spouse of the former president, said, "There's only four kinds of people in this world: those who have been caregivers, those who are currently caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who need caregiving." And I also wanted to give a quote from the Jewish tradition that you might be interested in, Reverend Hagler. And that is that God gave burdens, but he also gave shoulders. And that's what this discussion you're hosting this morning is all about. It's about caring. And what I wanted to ask, and I'm sorry if you've already discussed it, I got on the call late, is that the aging population in the United States is going so quickly. People are predicting a tsunami of folks turning 65 and older. And do our guests think that our society, our country, is able to deal with this tsunami?
Good question. Good question. Go ahead, either one of you.
I think that right now we have not made the investments that are necessary to be prepared for this, what I'm hearing you call, what I've heard called a silver tsunami. I think for too long, caregiving work of all kinds has been done at the expense of the women who do the work, kind of on the backs of the exploitation of the women who do this work. So what we want is to make real investments in this workforce so that an increased accessibility of care for those who need it goes hand in hand with good jobs for those who are providing care. And so that's why we're fighting for significant federal investment through Build Back Better. And also there's many efforts at the state level to make sure that a significant amount of federal dollars that states have received recently through national recovery bills actually make it to the hands of home care workers and actually lead to increased benefits and wages for these workers. So I think we're not ready now, but we can be. We know what policy solutions we need to get ourselves ready for this crisis.
Good, good. And you want to add something to that?
Yes, I totally agree with Alana. Like, if you're making something a good job, people are going to be attracted for it. Like, make it a living wage, make it great living conditions, make it a good job and people will be doing them.
Thank you, thank you. And as you talk about this, I want to just lift up a couple of things, because when you're talking about this Bill of Rights that you're trying to get moving, and you're pointing out in your document that DC has no legal protection against employment discrimination and harassment. Most domestic workers belong to groups that have historically been marginalized and targeted for discrimination: women, people of color, immigrants, older workers. And because their work is isolated in private homes, they are vulnerable to discrimination, including sexual harassment. Under DC's current law, domestic workers have no recourse if they experience discrimination or harassment. That's amazing. Domestic workers are also excluded from the right to a healthy and safe workplace. During the COVID-19 pandemic that we're currently in, folks have continued to work without protection, even adequate PPE, putting their lives at risk as well as their families and communities. And as we skip down, we look at this document: domestic work remains a low-wage one, and you're looking for solutions. Include domestic workers in the same human rights protections and occupational safety and health protections as other DC workers. 2, require written agreements between domestic workers and hiring entities and publish a model agreement to ensure workers know their rights and employers are aware of their responsibilities. And 3, establish a domestic work outreach and education program with the Department of Employment Services that will collaborate with organizations that work with domestic workers and employers to provide education and training on labor standards in the community. That seems all just very logical, very sensible. What's the problem with getting traction? Can't you get traction on this?
I agree that it is all logical and simple, and we hope that this bill will fly through the legislative process in the DC Council once it's introduced. We're really excited
Who's going
that
to introduce it?
we're really excited that Councilmember Alyssa Silverman has committed to introduce the legislation this year. So we're thrilled to hopefully see that introduction soon, and we hope soon after the introduction, the bill will swiftly move towards a hearing, a markup, and then to be voted on in the full council. Domestic workers have been waiting years for these protections, and specifically in DC, the campaign to remedy this exclusion started back in 2018. So it's been a long time that this fairly simple set of laws and protections has been waiting.
Let me check back with the studio. Do we have any other callers on the line? All right. And so one of the things I know, one of the classic arguments always I hear coming from the council is that you have a solution that's trying to look for a problem. That's always the argument to deflect, trying to do something. How do you deal with that type of mentality?
I mean, I think that we're offering what is a very common sense solution around which there should be simple and significant political will. And we hope that will be the case. When a domestic workers bill of rights was introduced for the first time in the council back in September 2019, there were 11 out of the 13 council members who were co-sponsors or co-introducers of the bill. So we know that there is support on the council for this bill, and we've met with all 13 council members last year, and we hear support for this bill. But we really need council members to go to bat for this issue, and to say that these are workers that have long been undervalued and need to be valued. And I think the money to community organizations that you mentioned to help people know their rights and bring claims when violations occur is key to making this bill real. We want this protection to not just live on paper. We want people to know about their new rights. We want them to be able to enforce their new rights. And so we're hoping that this kind of community enforcement approach where community groups help workers and employers of domestic workers know their rights will make this something that's real. And we think and hope that that's appealing to the council, that there's kind of grassroots enforcement of this law built into the legislation.
Where can people go online to find more information, and where can people go online to get involved, or what number can they call to get involved?
We hope that everyone will go to domesticworkers.org/DC Bill of Rights. So that's domesticworkers.org/DC Bill of Rights. And you can read more about what's in the bill. You can sign a petition to say that you care about this. You can learn about upcoming events. And speaking of upcoming events, we have an event this Tuesday, which is February 15th. It's going to be on Zoom. It's a kind of listening session between leaders in the faith community and domestic workers in the DMV. Anyone is welcome to join. We would love to have you there to dive more into this issue and to hear from more domestic workers in the DMV. And if you want to sign up for that event, for this listening session, community conversation, you can go to tinyurl, that's tinyurl.com/DC domestic workers and sign up there.
All right. And what is your hope for all this organizing? What is your hopes and dreams for all this organizing for people that you know and for people that work in the same capacity that you've worked in?
To pass the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, we have been fighting for way too long. This should be an easy yes for it to pass.
What states have it passed in? What states do you have already this bill passed?
Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. Let's see. I'll see if I can rattle them all off. New York, Hawaii, Illinois, New York, Connecticut, Philadelphia, Seattle, Virginia, Oregon, I believe, and I may be forgetting one. But just recently, the Virginia bill, our kind of just our neighbors to the south, the Virginia bill passed right at the beginning of 2021 and has some similar protections to this bill. And just at the end of last year, New York City passed a bill to end the exclusion of domestic workers from their human rights law. So there's good company for this all over the country, and we don't want DC to wait anymore to be state number 11.
Let me ask this question though, because one thing to get something passed. How is it being enforced in those places? Is it being enforced in those places? It's one thing to have statutes on the books, but unless you have follow-up to enforce those statutes, it's just words on a page.
Yep, absolutely. And I think enforcement is particularly difficult in the domestic work industry because of the very individual private nature of the work. Many of the bills of rights have community enforcement built in, which is what we hope to do in DC as well, where a local labor enforcement agency partners with community groups who already have relationships with workers, who have trust in the community of workers, and funds community groups to do trainings, to empower and train workers to both know their rights and teach other workers their rights and help other workers bring claims. So it's not relying on a worker having to come into the official enforcement agency where there's so many barriers, language, immigration status, fear to filing an official complaint, but they can work with a community group who they already know and are connected to. And that model exists in San Francisco, exists in New York, exists in Los Angeles. We hope it will exist here. And in many places, there's a very proactive labor enforcement agency, like in Massachusetts, where they're issuing the template contracts, and in Seattle, where they are working very closely with community groups around the enforcement of rights. So we hope here there would also be kind of active enforcement partnership between community groups and the Department of Employment Services in DC.
Now, you're not a labor union, right?
We're not a union. Domestic workers were left out of the National Labor Relations Act, so we don't legally have the right to unionize that other workers have. And at the same time, the structure of domestic work, of each worker being an individual in a home, doesn't lend itself to the power to unionize and collectively bargain in the same way, because everyone has an individual employer as some other work industries. I like to think that we fulfill some of the the rights and responsibilities of a union, and that we bring people together, we help people know their rights, we build community among similar workers, but we can't collectively bargain on behalf of our workers. No.
What has been your relationship with the labor unions?
We love the labor unions. We've worked with them on some campaigns. Like last summer, we fought along many of the unions in DC for an essential workers bill here in the district. And we are excited to we've had conversations with the Metro Washington Labor Council here, and SEIU 1199, SEIU 32BJ, and other locals here who are excited to show up in support of this bill.
All right. Well, I just want to really thank you. We're really out of time. Ann, you've been a little quiet, so I'm gonna ask you to say some closing words for us right now.
Yes, I appreciate you all for listening. This is such an important bill. If you see anything in your mailbox about the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, I highly encourage you to log on to the website, say that you're interested. We need your support. The council needs to hear from you, especially if you're a DC resident.
All right, Alina, step back just a little bit, show everybody your t-shirt, because we're going to post this and people are going to be able to see it. You see that? Oh, they're both of you. Step back so everybody can see it. You see it right? National Domestic Workers Alliance on those t-shirts. So that's what we wanted to see. So I want to thank you both for being a part of us today. We are out of time. I want to thank you, Ann Kearney and Lina Eichner, for being with us this morning. I thank you, the audience, for joining us this morning. I look forward to being with you again on the second Wednesday of the month. I would like to thank our engineer, Michael Nasala, and Verna Avery Brown, our executive producer, and the entire WPFW community. I can't wait to be with you again, but I want you to be empowered, be uplifted, and be blessed, knowing that we have a lot yet to get done, and we will do it. Thank you.
Black is you, black is me, black is us, black is free, black is free, black is me.
Black is velvet.
Thank y'all.
Thank you
Thank you
so
so
much.
much.
Oh my gosh, what a total pleasure to get